Before we begin the conversations and these questions, I have a few words of institutional thanks and recognition on behalf of everyone who was involved in this project. Principally first, thanks is given to Teresa Costantini, without whom the project would not have been possible. Of course, the authors themselves are to be greatly thanked. Then principally, Teresa, to Fundación Arte Vivo and its team, go thanks, UNSAM, Universidad Nacional de San Martín, their Cátedra John Maxwell Coetzee in Literatures of the South, Malba, the museum, and Malba Literatura, NYU's Gallatin School of Individualized Study, Random House, and Planeta. Thank you all. To start with, early on in the film, John, you mentioned that of all the presentations of Here and Now in diverse countries around the world, the one in Buenos Aires was the most interesting one. Why? More interesting in what ways? And did you, Paul, also have that impression?
Paul and I presented the book in 3 or 4 countries. I think the first was here. What I hadn't realized was that Paul had a very enthusiastic and considerable following in Buenos Aires, probably in Argentina as a whole, among young and old, and even getting to the auditorium in his company proved to be quite a problem because of all the clamor around us, people wanting to touch him. That was the interesting part of it.
You see, I remember the book fair as being a terrible failure because the translation system didn't work. The woman doing the simultaneous interpretation was in a booth, and rather than her words going into the earphones that we were listening to, they were broadcast into the auditorium. And so her voice was competing with our trying to talk, so we had to interrupt the thing after about 1 minute and wait, I think, for 20 minutes while they fixed this error. And by that time, I thought the whole spirit of the thing it was like a balloon. It just lost all its air. Yeah. But you see, we have different memories. Yeah.
It works when you put it on the table. Well, I think that came up in the film as well. But, to get to the point of some of the contexts that you chose for the film or that ended up being highlighted in the film, I thought I might ask you about the particular settings that were selected. How were those settings selected? How were they chosen and why?
To me?
Sure.
Well, actually, John was in the south of France, and he said we could come, and I thought I was so enthusiastic about the idea of being involved in this documentary, and to spend time with John and Paul in their different places. And so he was in the south of France, and we went there, and then it took us a longer time to get to Paul because I had some issues in the meantime. So at one point we're there and it's winter, and I think it benefited terribly the image of the film that we have this summer in the south of France and the winter in New York. But those were the places that we found them, as a way of saying.
This is collaborative interview here. Right, so there isn't a specific kind of driving force about the south of France for John's writing and New York, Brooklyn for Paul's.
Well, it's closer than Australia, right? Yeah. Yeah.
What about the place that isn't where you're usually found, or most of the year not, Buenos Aires? Do you have a relationship with this particular city, or what kind of a relationship does your creative process have with this city, in the case perhaps of Teresa? And of course, in the case of John, now coming regularly to this region for a specific purpose, could you also talk about that relationship with Buenos Aires?
Who first? Me? Yeah, I have the least to say. This is the third time I've been here. Each one of my trips has only been to the city here, and they've been very brief. The Costantini family are my friends, and I've known them since the beginning of all this. As each time I've been here at Malba to do one thing or another. And then I have, my publisher is here, and I came mostly on a private mission. That's why I'm here. But coincidentally, I did some events around my book, and tomorrow I go home. So it's, I think one of the great drawbacks for me is that I don't speak Spanish. And not knowing Spanish, I can't really penetrate the culture very deeply. I like being here. I think that people have always been remarkably generous and warm to me. But I feel that I'm at a remove. I don't know enough to be able to comment on anything about this city or Argentina in general. A secret mission means I can't talk about it.
Well, there's Buenos Aires and there's Buenos Aires. I've been coming back for some years now and have been trying to experience a little more than the shall we say, the Buenos Aires of the intelligentsia, of a very vibrant cosmopolitan culture, and to see a little more of Argentina as a whole, and of the, shall we say, less fortunate sides of the city of Buenos Aires. Through the kindness of Carlos Urruta, who was until recently rector of the Universidad San Martín, I got to see other parts of the country. And by and large, I'm not really a big city person. I'm more interested in life as it is lived, I suppose, by ordinary people and in ordinary circumstances. That on the one hand. On the other hand, because I've been involved in the teaching of literature or literatures here in Buenos Aires for a while now, and I've tried to deepen myself a little in the history and literature of Argentina. I have some relation with the country which is not a deep one, but which is a very affectionate one, and in many ways an admiring one.
Well, and in my case, in terms of the movie, Soledad and I met you here, Paul, and I think you came more than 3 times.
No.
You didn't? What?
2002, 2014, and now.
I see. So, and Siri came too. Okay, and also I met John here. So Buenos Aires was and we are from Argentina, so in terms of them accepting us to actually get into the here and now to make the documentary, it was important that Buenos Aires was present.
And how collaborative was the making of the documentary? I mean, was it mostly you, Teresa, shaping the film, or did you, Paul, John, also participate in any way, make any requests?
No, they didn't. They were so supportive. I mean, and yeah, I actually thought in terms. I'm a storyteller. I'm not very familiar with documentary, but I needed to tell a story, and I think for me, but that's my point of view. Mainly, friendship was a very important topic, and I stressed that as much as I could. As you know, as a kind of rounding the whole story of the letters. Friendship is for me very important, and I thought it was. They talk a lot about it, so it was a shaping that, as we do, we shape it in the editing room a lot. But they were very supportive, and they helped us a lot.
I thought the photography of Brooklyn and New York was beautiful, and I think you're right. The snow was a great enhancement. It helped so much. And there was one shot of the Brooklyn Bridge in the fog, which I'm never going to forget that. It was a beautiful shot. Yeah, yeah.
Teresa, you chose the word carefully. You called us supportive, and I think we were. We realized you had a task on your hands, and we wanted to help you in whatever way we can, but we were not collaborators. You did it all yourself, and you did it with material that's difficult to work with, because writers do nothing but sit in front of keyboards and with their heads down, and making a movie out of that was a real triumph. So congratulations.
What about the music? Could I ask you a little bit about the music? The beginning is characteristically Argentine music, yes. Tango, then later we hear some classical, there's a harpsichord in there somewhere, and then contemporary piece that sounds like it has some Latin American instruments. Am I wrong? Could you tell us about the music?
Well, actually, the music always comes at the end, but what I can say about the music, emulating a bit Piazzolla and Mulligan, we were driving with John through the south of France, and I had that music with me, and we were listening to it, and it seemed like it went so well with the whole atmosphere, and he liked it so much that I stressed to my composer, Osvaldo Montes, to actually do something about it. We couldn't use the Piazzolla, and so he had to record something new. And then mainly he was evolving, just sending pieces that we were choosing, and for the ending I thought it was nice to be with something more cheerful, or I don't know, it's that kind of, it creates atmosphere. I was trying to actually help whatever they were saying, and the landscape was also informing us.
In the film, as also in the letters, friendship comes out as something of a riddle in terms of why and how it lasts, as opposed to other kinds of relationships. Above and beyond the Here and Now project, which was in a limited time period and is over, what about your friendship? What do you think makes it click? Why does it last?
Well, as I think John expressed it in the, not in the book, but in the interview he gave, we hit it off. I don't know why. I think he said we share so much, and I think that's true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to like each other. I think we have a certain attitude about who we are and how we work, and that's very similar. And so I think we can understand each other. But again, it's a mystery. I wouldn't presume to know the answer to that. What was the other part of the question? That's it, right? Okay.
No, I have very little to add. You know, as with erotic relations, it's a question whether it is a good idea to be too inquisitive about their basis, whether it's a good idea to ask why one is friends with X or Y. I'm not sure.
You know, because I think I had a different view of friendship from John's, and which I expressed in subsequent letters, because I feel that rather than being transparent, friendship between men in any case can often be very opaque, and we don't really know what's going on. And sometimes we get fooled. We think our friend is one thing, and turns out he's been up to something he never told us about, and it might be something that we're not particularly happy with. And I've also found that friendships have, for me, in any case, over the years have died. Friends I was close to when I was young drifted away. And all through the different stages of my life, there have been friends who seem to be close, and for one reason or another, the friendships end. It's not that there's any break or any argument, it's just people drift apart. So over all these many years that I've been alive, I really only have a core of a few lifelong friends, and I value them very, very much. But it's not as though, I think in general, we keep our friends for forever. I don't know. Maybe you've kept all your friends, I don't know.
I've done my best, yeah.
You did say in the film, Paul, that you thought there was more to explore and more to talk about in terms.
Well, more on a lot of fronts, but it's fine. I'm very pleased with the way the thing worked out, and I like the fact that we dart around a bit and that we don't keep hammering away at the same thing. I tend to get kind of dogged about things and want to keep pushing, and but I think John was right then to deflect onto other subjects. And yeah, it was a curious project. It was very fun to do, very engaging. The letter that is quoted towards the end of the film, I really did start to walk around talking to John in my head, and that was a very strange thing. It never happened to me with anyone. Right now, it's funny, I'm writing a book about an American writer who's dead, long dead, and I'm talking to him now. I keep saying, you know, you've been dead 120 years, but look at that thing in New York now. It's so different, and it's, I guess, the childish part of myself that acts that way.
In the film, I think it's you, Paul, who makes clear that the letters in Here and Now weren't culled from the raw material of a long exchange between you and John, but rather were from the beginning aimed at producing a book. But interestingly, that statement, that admission, doesn't cheapen the project. Instead, it seems to make it clearer that a friendship between two great writers, two literary artists, rather puts back on the table the figure of the public intellectual. I think you, John, spoke of registering the history of our time in letter form. To both of you then, if literary writers and artists were to recover a more public, historically influential role, in what spaces would you envision that taking place? And on what issues would you deem worthy of the most urgent attention?
Well, I think one of the great advantages of the letter format, as was pointed out in the movie, is that we didn't have an opportunity to look back and reflect in the light of subsequent events, in the light of history. We were registering events that were occurring in the world in the here and now. And I think that one of the events pseudo events that occurred during the course of the writing of the book was the crash, the financial crash of 2008, I think it was, of which I produced an analysis in the form of a letter claiming that the crash was entirely illusory, that it had no reality at all, and that we were all under the spell of a fantasy when we reacted to it. What I'm pointing to is the fact that the format of the book allowed one to be dramatically wrong and to have no way of putting that right. So that was one of the advantages. The other advantage of the format, I think, was that it was dialogical. It was an exchange between two people on a range of ideas, including current affairs. And it, to a large extent, forestalled either of us from getting on the soapbox and declaiming, because either the writer himself or the interlocutor would very soon take him down. Paul?
Public intellectuals, I don't know, writers. In the country I live in, writers are of no interest to anybody. Writers are not part of the national conversation anymore. Writers are never asked to be on television, and television is finally where you reach great numbers of people. And without the opportunity to listen to writers on television in America, we don't really know what they're saying, because when they do write, it's usually in magazines that are of limited circulation, sometimes a little thing in the newspaper, not much. Other countries in the West, it seems to me, are more interested still in what writers have to say, but to what effect, I'm not sure, because when writers speak about politics, finally, they're no different from any other citizen. We don't know anything more than anyone else. In America, we have a whole category of person which really doesn't exist anywhere else. It's called Hollywood movie star. And these are our royalty. These are the nobility of the United States, and people worship them. And they're very eager to hear what Hollywood actors and actresses have to say about current situations. But the remarks they make tend not to be terribly interesting. So I don't have an answer for you.
Thank you. One striking and very alluring aspect in the film is hearing your voices and your specific ways of speaking English, actually, in this dialogic exchange. Really comes to life in the film. English is a language that you have in common, but obviously quite different in each of your practices and your contexts. And as the film makes evident, even in your mouths. John, while speaking French, citing French translations of both of your works, you describe how the English language is actually a foreign instrument to you. You even go on to say that you find your own English bloodless and purged of local markers. Of course, you're talking about your novels, but do you also feel your relationship with English is like that when you're writing letters to your friend?
Well, I have a relationship with the English language which is becoming more and more unhappy. The book, which is now 7 or 8 years old, at least in its writing, doesn't belong to quite the present phase of my life. But as you point out, English is for me an acquired language which I speak like a very well-schooled foreigner. It doesn't feel to me maternal in any sense. I'm not nourished by it, and have no particular interest in nourishing it in return. your question was, do I feel a relationship with English of the kind I've been describing when I'm writing letters? I suppose the answer is yes, except that in the letters to Paul, I'm very well aware that Paul is an American and that there's a whole range of American idiom and colloquialism which I know sort of from the outside and which I'm interested to explore via Paul from the inside. So, for example, we had that curious metaphor, going to hell in a handbasket, which we spent a lot of time on in the letters, and so forth.
I realized that I made an error in the letters. I didn't explain myself clearly enough way back whenever I wrote it. The different kinds of English I mentioned, Indian English and Irish English, etc. I guess I was talking about accents, just the way English sound. Of course, the grammar is the same. Of course, the syntax is the same. Are we back? Yeah, essentially the same. It was my error in not being more specific. I myself, I speak English just out of a fluke of history, just the same as you. My grandparents were immigrants. No one spoke English in my family before the 20th century. But as a third-generation boy, or the second born in America, that was my native language, the only language I knew until I was about 13 when I started studying French in school. I feel, I have to say, very lucky to have been given this language. I think English is an extraordinary medium because of the complex history that went into making it. It started out as Anglo-Saxon, which is absolutely incomprehensible to anyone today. But then in 1066, the British invaded, the French invaded Britain and conquered the country. And so French and Anglo-Saxons started coming together and formed this new language that really didn't become anything resembling what we would call English until, I would say, around 1520. We had something called Middle English before that. And then you have the first great lyric poets in the 1530s. Sir Thomas Wyatt, for example, is a wonderful English poet. He kind of invented English poetry. This is many decades before Shakespeare. And I feel that the double origin of English gives it a kind of extra strength that most languages don't have. You look at a Romance language dictionary, and it's only half the size of an English dictionary. We have many, many words for the same thing, but with subtle nuances among them. So I find myself lucky.
Could I ask you all a little bit about place? In the film, obviously, place is registered with that distinct emotional impact, but in the letters as well, and listening to your voice, I think it's the description of physical place, particularly West 57th Street, is evoked as an example that contains primordial sediments, and that actually prompts an archaeology of personal history, layers upon layers of memory. But in another part of the documentary, Teresa, you also captured a moment when you were looking at a place where a film that you made was produced. And there, in front of the intersection, you say, this used to be a place of the imagination, but now it's just a bleak winter day. And that seems pretty ironic, actually, because but I guess the question is, again, about the role of the artist, of the literary writer, registering our time, making layers and layers of memory enduring. Isn't it true that the bleak winter day is a little more transient than the work that you made there?
No, not really. It was a speck of a moment. I don't know. I guess films survive, but it was always imaginary. That corner, you see, which Teresa filmed, was where the supposed cigar store was in the 2 movies I made with Wayne Wang, Smoke and Blue in the Face. Of course, the sign, you see, was not a real sign. It was made out of styrofoam. It was just, you know, because everything about movies is fake. You try to make it look real, but it's fake. And I like the fact that it's fake, and you just, then you use your imagination to make it real. And something, is it heaven? I don't know. Celestial music. Or The Gods Must Be Crazy. Remember that movie? Yeah. All right. Anyway, that's it, because you expressed it extremely well. It is interesting how if you live in a place long enough, you have layers of memories, not just one particular of a place. And I have movie memories now of New York and Brooklyn. So these are places where I spent a lot of time, days on end, and so they have a special feel to me. And when I go past them now, well, they're just like that corner on a bleak winter day. It's just life as normal. And there's something poignant about it, I feel.
Could we ask you also, John, about this notion of place? Do you also have certain places, physical places in the world, like Paul's West 57th Street, that might be your primordial digs? Where, or perhaps what, might they be?
Well, as I said, I'm not really a city person. The primordial place for me would be rural South Africa, where I spent a lot of my childhood. But it's not a part of the world I go back to very often.
Could I ask you, Teresa, also to share a little bit on this particular topic? Because I noticed there are a series of images and tracks that you've put into the film that are your own personal choice as a director. Also in your feature-length films, you work very much with a strong visual vocabulary of Buenos Aires. Are we looking also at some part of your own significant places?
Well, I think the fascinating or important thing to me in this was that there were resounding emotional feelings in all the places that I was shooting. The south of France was evoking things that, I mean, I had never been there, but there was something in it that I actually connected to. And of course, New York and Brooklyn are places that I go very often. I go so often that I was so lucky to be able to shoot there, which I am so thankful to. And Buenos Aires is, of course, the place, yes. And so I think, yes, you're cold? Sorry. And yeah, well, Buenos Aires had to be, I actually chose things that had to do with, you know, the road to the Feria del Libro and this avenue that had the meaning of us circulating in the city and just taking them from there as a passage from the other emotional feelings they were giving us.
Right, a lot of the same places that, and events that are taking place now surrounding the conversation that we've been having and which I now thank you for and close. Thank you very much.